Hello there folks, and welcome to another episode of the Book Club. On this week's episode, we will be discussing the second Discworld book, The Light Fantastic by Sir Terry Pratchett. So with that introduction over with, let's get on with it. The Light Fantastic concludes the adventures of Rincewind, the failed wizard, and Twoflower, the curious tourist from the Agatean Empire, who were left at the end of the color of magic, falling in some style off the edge of the world being, of course, disc-shaped, said disc being on the back of 4 giant elephants who in turn are perching on the shell of the Great Artone, a celestial turtle. Hope you got that. Looking back briefly at the color of magic, I think on reflection I may have not clearly conveyed my awe at the wonder that was Terry Pratchett. He was a creative and comic genius, and my admiration of his body of work is tinged with sadness that he will no longer be adding to it. As comic writers go, I would put him almost on a par with the likes of Douglas Adams. I can think of no higher praise. Surprisingly, Rincewind and Twoflower do not plummet to their icy deaths. They are saved by the Octavo, one of the most powerful books of magic in the Discworld, which in a pretty shameless plot device, adjusts reality, to prevent the loss of one of its spells living inside Rincewind's head, sending them to the charmingly named Forest of Skund. In a parallel storyline, the senior wizards of the Unseen University try to find out what is going on by summoning Death, who warns them of the impending destruction of Discworld. Discworld fans will notice that as part of their clumsy investigations into the Octavo, this happens, a thick column of spitting light sprang up from the book, hit the ceiling in a splash of flame, and disappeared. The room had been part of the library until the magic had drifted through, violently reassembling the possibility particles in its path. Several of the wizards later swore that the small sad orang-outung sitting in the middle of it all looked very much like the head librarian. Yes indeed, here we have the origin story of how the Unseen University's head librarian became a monkey-sorry ape, and decided to stay that way. Rincewind and Twoflower's misadventures continue. With the aid of an aging hero Cohen the Barbarian, they rescue a young woman named Bethan, who forms an unconventional relationship with Cohen, which gives us one of the dodgiest jokes in the whole of the Discworld series, and possibly in the 20th century. I am not going to set it out here in full, but it ends with the punchline, "We'll just have to hope she's strong enough." Later the quip grinning like a necrophiliac in a morgue from elsewhere in the novel runs it close in terms of tastelessness. Pratchett thankfully toned down the bad taste jokes and the buxom warrior maidens running around with little to protect their modesty than a leather thong later in the series. The Light Fantastic contains plenty of other groan-worthy jokes. Ultimately, Rincewind reads all 8 of the Octavo's spells aloud. This causes the moons of the Red Star to crack open and reveal tiny world turtles that follow their Artone on a course away from the star. The apocalypse is thus neatly and rather sweetly avoided. Twoflower decides to return home, observing that until you go home you haven't really been anywhere, and leaves the luggage with Rincewind as a parting gift. When the early Discworld novels were published, I read them with a degree of guilt. They were my guilty pleasures that I would put away in the presence of other adults. Not only did they have no pretensions to being anything other than a bit of fun, there were cheap jokes, stock characters, cliched situations, and simple plot resolutions. There was just a lot of messing about. Cohen the Barbarian? Please. It wasn't until some time well into the series that they began to develop a depth, not God forbid seriousness, and a more lyrical quality to go with the silly jokes and the one-liners. The light social commentary became more thoughtful, having a purpose of its own rather than just being an excuse for some humor. Most of all, his characters became real, flawed, complex and fully rounded. We wouldn't have Going Postal, or The Night Watch, without The Color of Magic, and The Light Fantastic, but I am really glad we have. Just one last point. If you look very closely at the cover illustration, still used for the Corgi editions, you will see the illustrator has shown Twoflower with 4 eyes. This refers back to a reference in, I think, The Color of Magic, where someone describes him as having 4 eyes, a fairly obvious reference to him wearing glasses. I suspect this mistake, which it must surely be, was identified early on, but they kept it in because they found it funny. That ends our discussion of The Light Fantastic by Terry Pratchett. Join us next week where we will be discussing another novel. Until then, thank you for watching, stay safe and happy reading.